Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
Imagine waking up in a hospital, weak and vulnerable, only to discover the one person you trusted most had betrayed you in the worst possible way. My brother didn't just ruin my financial safety net, he shattered my faith in family. But his excuses? Those left me questioning everything. I've always been the type of person who plans for the worst. Maybe it's because I grew up watching my parents argue over money when I was a kid. That kind of thing leaves a mark. While others my age spent their 20s maxing out credit cards or chasing dreams with zero fallback, I had spreadsheets, emergency funds, and a carefully calculated budget. Life is unpredictable, but if there's one thing you can control, it's how prepared you are for it. On the other end of the spectrum was my older brother, Jake. Jake, the life of every party. The guy who could make friends with a rock if he needed to, and the self-proclaimed king of I'll figure it out later. He had a talent for charm and a curse for responsibility, or lack thereof. Where I saw financial stability as peace of mind, Jake saw it as a safety net he could dip into whenever life got inconvenient. Growing up, Jake and I had been thick as thieves. He was my protector, the cool older brother who'd sneak me candy when mom wasn't looking or let me tag along with his friends when I felt left out. But adulthood changed us. While I settled into a steady job, quietly building a life brick by brick, Jake hopped between gigs, always with some big idea that would change everything. One month, he was flipping furniture. The next, he was investing in cryptocurrency. It was like watching someone throw darts at a board while blindfolded. I never judged him out loud, though. Jake was Jake, reckless, yes, but he was family. And if family isn't there for you, then what's the point? That belief was tested when a car accident flipped my carefully planned life upside down. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, as most disasters do. I was driving home from work, running through my mental checklist of to-dos for the evening. Pay the electric bill, meal prep, maybe finally start that book collecting dust on my nightstand. I didn't see the pickup truck blow through the red light until it was too late. The impact spun my car like a toy, shattering windows and filling my ears with the deafening crunch of metal on metal. I woke up hours later in a hospital bed, groggy from painkillers and overwhelmed by a wave of disorientation. A nurse stood over me, her face kind, but her words a blur. I had a broken arm, some cracked ribs, and a nasty concussion. The doctor said I'd need a few weeks to recover minimum. As I processed the news, my first thought wasn't about the pain or even the car. It was relief that I had my emergency savings to cover whatever came next. Jake was the first person I called, partly because I needed someone to check on my apartment, and partly because, deep down, I hoped he'd step up. He answered on the third ring, his voice groggy, like I'd woken him up from a nap. "Hey, Jake," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm in the hospital." That woke him up fast. "What? What happened? Are you okay?" I explained the situation, and to his credit, he sounded genuinely concerned. "Do you need me to come over?" "I can handle whatever you need," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. It was a small comfort. Jake might be irresponsible, but he had a good heart. "Yeah," I replied. "Could you pick up my mail? Maybe water the plants? I'll probably be here for a bit." "Of course," he said. "Don't worry about a thing. I got it covered." Hearing that was a relief. At least I didn't have to stress about the little things while I was stuck in a hospital gown, eating Jell-O and trying to ignore the ache in my ribs. But life has a funny way of twisting the knife when you least expect it. While I lay in that hospital bed, focusing on healing, Jake was at my apartment, doing a whole lot more than collecting mail. When you're lying in a hospital bed, time becomes this weird, sluggish thing. Days and nights blur into one another, and you lose track of reality outside those sterile walls. That's why, when I woke up groggy after surgery, my first instinct was to check my phone for a connection to the outside world. The screen lit up with an avalanche of text messages and missed calls, most of them from Jake. For a moment, I felt a wave of gratitude. At least someone was looking out for me. The texts were casual, Jake letting me know he'd stopped by my apartment, watered the plants, and even tidied up a bit. "Don't worry," he wrote in one message. "I've got everything under control." In the haze of post-surgery painkillers, his words were a small comfort. Jake might have been reckless and impulsive, but in moments like these, he could be reliable. I even felt a pang of guilt for all the times I'd silently judged him for his lack of responsibility. Maybe I'd underestimated him. But that fleeting gratitude didn't last long. While scrolling through my notifications, I spotted something that made my stomach drop. A fraud alert from my bank. My emergency savings account, the one I'd spent years carefully building, was almost empty. At first, I thought it was some sort of mistake. There was no way. I had just checked it a few weeks ago, and it had around $8,000. Panicked, I opened the banking app, my heart pounding in my chest. Sure enough, there it was, transaction after transaction, totaling nearly the entire balance. I stared at the screen in disbelief, my mind racing to make sense of it. Was my account hacked? Had my identity been stolen? But then I noticed something odd. The charges weren't random or scattered. They were all tied to one thing, a local car dealership. The pieces started falling into place in the worst way imaginable. Jake. My pulse quickened as anger and confusion churned in my chest. No, he wouldn't. He couldn't. Jake knew how much that money meant to me. He knew it wasn't just sitting there for fun. It was my lifeline, my safety net. I called him immediately, my hands shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the phone. He picked up on the second ring, his voice cheerful. Hey, how are you feeling? Jake, I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rage boiling beneath the surface. What the hell is going on with my bank account? There was a pause, just long enough to confirm my worst fears. Oh, he said casually, as though we were talking about something trivial, about that. Jake, I interrupted, my voice sharper now. Did you touch my savings? Did you take my money? He sighed, as if I was the one inconveniencing him. Look, I was going to tell you, he said, his tone defensive. I just needed to borrow it for something important. What the hell could possibly be so important that you emptied my savings without asking? I demanded. My voice was rising, drawing the attention of a passing nurse who shot me a concerned glance. I got a car, Jake said, as though that explained everything. It's a great deal, really. You'd be proud of me. I negotiated the price down by $3,000. I was speechless. The audacity, the sheer gall of it, left me momentarily stunned. A car? You drained my account for a car? You don't understand, he said quickly, as though he was the victim in all of this. My old car finally died, and I needed a reliable one for work. You know how much I've been struggling with transportation? This car is going to change everything for me. You mean the car you didn't have the money for? I shot back. Jake, that money wasn't yours to take. That was for emergencies, for medical bills, for... Yeah, well, you're in the hospital, he interrupted, his voice growing defensive. You're not exactly using it right now, are you? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The sheer entitlement in his tone made my blood boil. That's not the point, Jake. It's my money. You had no right. I thought you'd understand, he snapped, cutting me off. You're always so good with money, always planning ahead. I figured you'd bounce back from this no problem. But me? I don't have that kind of luxury, okay? I needed it more than you did. The conversation spiraled from there, with Jake insisting I was overreacting and me barely able to contain my fury. Every excuse he gave was a slap in the face. He didn't see it as theft, he saw it as borrowing, as if draining my account without permission was some harmless favor. When I finally hung up, my hands were trembling and tears of frustration stung my eyes. Jake had crossed a line I didn't even know existed. He hadn't just stolen my money, he'd stolen my trust. I sat there in the hospital bed, staring blankly at the wall, trying to process what had just happened. Jake had always been impulsive, but this was something else entirely. He had taken advantage of me at my most vulnerable, and for what? A car? A deal too good to pass up? For the first time in my life, I felt a cold, hard certainty. Jake wasn't going to fix this on his own. He didn't even think he had done anything wrong. If I wanted justice, or even just my money back, I was going to have to take matters into my own hands. When you think about betrayal, you imagine it comes with some kind of weight, an apology, a shred of guilt, or at the very least, some awkward fumbling for excuses. What I didn't expect was how completely nonchalant Jake was about what he'd done. It was like I'd caught him eating the last slice of pizza, not draining my entire emergency savings. The phone call was still ringing in my ears long after I hung up. You're in the hospital, he had said, his tone bordering on cheerful. You're not even using the money right now. I had been so stunned in the moment that I couldn't fully process the audacity of it. It wasn't just what he had done, it was how he had done it. Jake acted like this was normal, like I was overreacting to something as minor as borrowing a pen without asking. I could still hear the casual way he'd chuckled, as if he'd just told me a mildly funny joke instead of confessing to something that could ruin me financially. It's not about me using it now. I had snapped, my voice trembling with a mix of fury and disbelief. It's about you taking it without asking. Jake didn't even flinch. Oh, come on, he said dismissively. Don't be so dramatic. I was in a tight spot, okay? My old car finally died, and I needed something reliable. What was I supposed to do? Walk everywhere? The more he talked, the angrier I got. Every word out of his mouth was a justification, an excuse, a deflection. Jake wasn't sorry. He didn't even seem to understand why I was upset. You were supposed to figure it out without stealing from me. I yelled into the phone, my free hand gripping the edge of the hospital bed, so hard my knuckles turned white. Jake, do you even realize what you've done? That money wasn't just sitting there for fun. It was for emergencies. For moments like this. Exactly, he said, his voice dripping with misplaced logic. And I had an emergency. My car broke down. How was I supposed to get to work? You know how important this is for me. For a moment, I was too stunned to respond. Did he seriously just equate his car trouble to my medical emergency? My head was spinning, both from the painkillers and from the sheer absurdity of what I was hearing. He continued, his voice growing more defensive. Look, I didn't want to bother you with it. I figured I'd just take care of it myself, you know? I didn't think you'd mind. You're always so responsible with money. I knew you'd bounce back from this no problem. I felt a white-hot rage bubbling up in my chest. Jake, this isn't about whether or not I can bounce back. It's about the fact that you didn't even ask. You stole from me. It's not stealing if I'm going to pay you back, he said, his tone implying I was being unreasonable. I wanted to scream. And how exactly are you planning to do that? You don't even have enough money to buy your own car, Jake. What makes you think you'll be able to pay me back? There was a pause, a long, telling silence that only confirmed what I already knew. He didn't have a plan. He had never intended to pay me back, at least not in any realistic time frame. Well, he said finally, his voice quieter now, I'll figure it out. I just need some time. Time isn't the issue, I shot back. The issue is that you had no right to do this in the first place. You took something that wasn't yours, Jake. That's not just crossing a line. It's obliterating it. Jake sighed loudly, the kind of sigh that said he was done with the conversation. Look, I'm sorry you're upset. Okay, but I don't see what the big deal is. I needed the money, and you weren't using it. What's done is done. You can't change it now, so why don't you just focus on getting better and let me handle the car? It was in that moment that I realized just how deep Jake's delusion ran. He wasn't just irresponsible. He was completely incapable of understanding the gravity of his actions. To him, I was being unreasonable. In his mind, he had done nothing wrong. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling with anger. My chest felt tight, my ribs aching from the stress of the conversation. A nurse poked her head into the room, her expression concerned. Everything okay? She asked gently. No, I said, my voice cracking. Everything is very much not okay. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, trying to make sense of Jake's twisted logic. How had he convinced himself that this was acceptable? Did he truly believe I would just let it slide? The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about the money. It was about trust. Jake hadn't just taken my savings. He had taken advantage of my vulnerability. He had exploited the fact that I was lying in a hospital bed, unable to do anything to stop him. By the time the sun set, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Jake thought he could brush this off, spin it like he was doing me a favor. But he was wrong. This was just the beginning, and I was determined to make him face the consequences of what he'd done, whether he liked it or not. Telling my parents what Jake had done was not a decision I made lightly. Part of me hoped they would rally behind me, call him out, and maybe even force him to take responsibility. But another part of me, one I didn't want to admit existed, feared they'd find a way to excuse him. Growing up, I had always noticed the subtle differences in how Jake and I were treated. He was the golden child, the firstborn with an easy smile and a knack for charming his way out of trouble. I, on the other hand, was the dependable one, the rule follower. When Jake made mistakes, they were framed as learning experiences. When I made mistakes, they were met with lectures about responsibility. So, with my heart pounding in my chest, I called my mom first. She picked up almost immediately, her voice warm and familiar. Hey, sweetie, how are you feeling? I didn't sugarcoat it. Mom, I need to talk to you about Jake. There was a pause, and I could practically hear her shifting into worry mode. What happened? Is he okay? He's fine, I said, the words catching in my throat. I'm not. I laid it all out for her, sparing no detail. I told her how Jake had drained my savings while I was in the hospital, how he justified it with excuses that made my blood boil, and how he showed no remorse for what he'd done. By the time I finished, my voice was shaking, and tears were threatening to spill over. Mom was silent for a moment, and I braced myself for her response. When she finally spoke, her voice was a mix of anger and disbelief. He did what? Hearing the outrage in her voice was a relief. At least one person in my family understood the gravity of the situation. I can't believe this, she said, her voice rising. How could he think this was okay? That's your money, your hard-earned savings. I'm going to call him right now, and... Wait, I interrupted, taking a deep breath. I don't need you to fight my battles, Mom. I need to know I'm not crazy for being this upset. You're not crazy, she said firmly. What he did was wrong, plain and simple. If you want, I can even help you pay it back. Her offer, while generous, stung more than I expected. I didn't want my mom to fix this. I wanted Jake to face the consequences of his actions. Thanks, Mom, I said softly, but this isn't about the money anymore. It's about what he did and the fact that he doesn't even think it's a big deal. I understand, she said, her voice heavy with disappointment. But I want you to know I'm here for you, no matter what. The conversation left me feeling a little lighter, but I wasn't naive enough to think it would be that simple. I still had to tell Dad. Dad's reaction was, as expected, far more neutral. When I called him and explained what Jake had done, his response was calm, too calm. Well, he said after a long pause, this isn't great, but you know how Jake is. He's always been impulsive. He probably thought he was doing the right thing at the time. I couldn't believe my ears. The right thing? Dad, he stole from me. He didn't steal, Dad said, his tone maddeningly even. He borrowed. There's a difference. No, there isn't, I shot back. Not when he didn't ask. Not when he left me high and dry with no money while I'm in the hospital. Dad sighed, as though I was the one being unreasonable. I'm not excusing what he did, he said. I just think you two need to work this out between yourselves. Jake's your brother. Family is complicated, but it's important. That word, family, hit me like a slap in the face. Why was it always my responsibility to fix things? Why did Jake's actions get brushed aside under the guise of family? Do you hear yourself, Dad? I said, my voice shaking with frustration. You're letting him get away with this because it's easier than holding him accountable. How is that fair to me? Dad didn't have an answer, and the conversation ended on a strained note. The divide between my parents' reactions mirrored the larger conflict brewing within me. On one hand, I wanted to believe Jake could redeem himself, that this was a one-time lapse in judgment. On the other hand, I couldn't ignore the pattern of behavior that had led us here. Jake had always been impulsive, yes, but this wasn't just impulsive. It was selfish, calculated, and dismissive of how his actions affected me. As the days passed, I started to wonder if this wasn't just about Jake being Jake. Maybe this was about the dynamics of our family, the roles we had been assigned without even realizing it. Jake was the one who got second chances. I was the one who picked up the pieces. And as much as I love my family, I couldn't keep playing that role anymore. The realization was sobering, and it left me with a bitter taste in my mouth. If I wanted to set things right, not just with Jake, but with myself, I was going to have to draw a line in the sand. And I had no idea how my family would react when I finally did. There's a strange feeling that comes over you when someone you love betrays you. It's not just anger or hurt. It's a hollow kind of disbelief, like your brain can't fully process what's happening. That was the feeling that followed me home from the hospital. Every time I thought about Jake, a mixture of emotions churned inside me. Rage, sadness, and something dangerously close to resignation. But I wasn't going to let that last one take root. As soon as I was discharged, I made a decision. Enough was enough. I wasn't going to let Jake weasel his way out of this with excuses and charm. I needed answers, accountability, and, most importantly, I needed him to understand just how deeply he had crossed the line. When I pulled up to Jake's house, the first thing I saw was the car. It sat gleaming in the driveway, all polished and new, as if it were mocking me. A shiny black sedan with chrome detailing, the kind of car that screamed, "Look at me, I'm doing well." Except Jake wasn't doing well. He was doing fine at my expense. I stepped out of the car, my pulse pounding in my ears. I was still sore from the accident, and my ribs protested every breath. But the adrenaline coursing through me drowned out the pain. I didn't even bother knocking. Jake's door was unlocked, typical, and I walked in without hesitation. He was in the living room, sprawled on the couch with his feet up on the coffee table. He was scrolling through his phone, earbuds in, completely oblivious to my presence. For a brief moment, I stood there, staring at him, trying to reconcile the carefree man in front of me with the brother who had stolen my savings. "Jake!" My voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. He startled, yanking out his earbuds. "Oh, hey," he said, his tone light and easy, as if nothing had happened. "What's up? You're out of the hospital already?" I ignored his question, cutting straight to the point. "We need to talk. Now." Jake's smile faltered, but only slightly. He sat up, gesturing to the couch across from him. "Sure. What's going on?" "What's going on?" I said, my voice trembling with controlled fury. is that you stole $8,000 from me, Jake. My entire emergency savings. And you used it to buy that damn car sitting in your driveway. The shift in his expression was subtle, but unmistakable. He went from casual to defensive in an instant. I didn't steal it, he said, his tone firm. I borrowed it. There's a difference. Are you kidding me? I snapped. You didn't ask. You didn't even tell me. You drained my account while I was lying in a hospital bed, Jake. How is that not stealing? Jake crossed his arms, leaning back against the couch like he was gearing up for a debate. Look, he said, I know you're upset, but I needed the money more than you did. My car broke down, and I had no way to get to work. What was I supposed to do? Figure it out without robbing me. I shot back. Do you even hear yourself? You're acting like this was some unavoidable emergency, but it wasn't. You had options, Jake. You could have taken the bus, borrowed a car, or even asked me for help. Instead, you went behind my back and stole from me. Jake's jaw tightened, and for the first time, his confidence wavered. I didn't think you'd mind, he said quietly, almost defensively. You're always so responsible with money. You got a steady job, a plan for everything. I figured you'd bounce back from this in no time. Hearing those words was like a slap in the face. That's not the point, I said, my voice breaking. This isn't about whether I can recover. It's about the fact that you thought you had the right to take something that didn't belong to you. Do you even feel guilty, Jake? Do you even realize what you've done? Jake looked away, his expression hardening. Of course I feel bad, he muttered. But what's done is done. I can't change it now, can I? So what's the point of making a big deal out of this? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The point, I said through gritted teeth, is that you need to take responsibility. You don't get to brush this off like it's nothing. You've put me in a terrible position, Jake. That money wasn't just sitting there for fun. It was my safety net. What if I need it for medical bills? What if something else goes wrong? Jake stood up, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. You think I don't know that? He said, his voice rising. You think I don't feel like crap for what I did? I didn't have a choice, okay? My car died, and I needed a way to get to work. If I lose my job, I'm screwed. You don't understand what it's like to feel that kind of pressure. Oh, don't even start, I said, my anger boiling over. You think I don't know what pressure feels like? I've spent my entire life planning and saving because I didn't want to end up in the kind of mess you've created for yourself. And now you've dragged me into it, too. For a moment, we stood there in tense silence, the air between us heavy with unspoken resentment. I could see it in his eyes. He didn't truly believe he was in the wrong. To him, I was overreacting, making a mountain out of a molehill. Listen, Jake said finally, his tone softer now. I'll pay you back, okay? It might take some time, but I'll make it right. I shook my head, my chest tightening with a mix of anger and heartbreak. It's not just about the money, Jake. It's about trust. You've destroyed that, and I don't know if you can fix it. Jake didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. And in that moment, I realized something that made my heart ache. Jake didn't feel guilty because he didn't think he had done anything wrong. To him, my financial stability was his safety net, something he could tap into whenever life got inconvenient. As I walked out of his house, past the shiny car that represented everything he had stolen from me, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. Jake thought he could smooth things over with empty promises and half-hearted apologies. But I wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. There's a certain clarity that comes with hitting rock bottom. After my confrontation with Jake, I sat alone in my apartment, replaying every word, every excuse, every dismissive laugh. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. Like no matter what I did, Jake would never understand the weight of what he had done. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle, the betrayal, and the complete lack of remorse. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something had to change. Jake had spent his whole life dodging consequences, and I'd spent mine cleaning up his messes. This time, I wasn't going to let him off the hook. I decided to start with the dealership. Jake had been more than happy to gloat about his amazing deal when I first confronted him, dropping little details that stuck in my mind. The name of the salesman, the make and model of the car, and how he'd worked his magic to negotiate a lower price. Jake loved to brag, and for once it worked in my favor. I scrolled through old text messages, searching for anything that could lead me to the dealership. It didn't take long to find what I needed. Jake had sent me a picture of the car the day he bought it, complete with the dealership's name in the background. Armed with that information, I made the call. The salesman who answered sounded upbeat and eager, no doubt hoping for a new customer. I introduced myself and explained that I was calling about a recent sale. My brother purchased a car from you about a week ago. I said, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. I just have a few questions about the transaction. Of course, he said, his voice friendly. Do you know the make and model? It was a black sedan, I said, giving him the specifics Jake had mentioned. I believe he financed it through you. There was a pause as the salesman pulled up the records. Ah, yes, I see it here, he said. Your brother was very enthusiastic about the purchase. Is there an issue I can help with? Actually, yes, I said, gripping the phone tighter. I just want to confirm, how much did he put down as a down payment? The salesman hesitated, likely unsure if he should be sharing this information. Well, he said slowly, he put down a significant amount, about $8,000. Hearing those words felt like a punch to the gut. I had suspected as much, but having it confirmed made it all the more real. Jake had taken every last penny of my savings to secure a car he couldn't even afford outright. And the rest? I asked, my voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. The rest is being financed, the salesman replied. It's a standard agreement. Is everything okay? Not exactly, I said, barely holding back my frustration. Thank you for your time. I hung up and sat in silence, the weight of the situation settling over me like a heavy blanket. Jake hadn't just stolen my money. He had leveraged it to dig himself deeper into financial instability. He had taken my safety net and turned it into a ticking time bomb, one that would inevitably blow up in his face. It was in that moment that I made my decision. Jake wasn't going to get away with this. Not this time. Filing a police report against my own brother was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I sat in the station, explaining the situation to an officer who looked at me with a mix of sympathy and disbelief. So, let me get this straight, he said, his pen hovering over his notepad. Your brother used your money without permission to buy a car? Yes, I said firmly. He drained my account while I was in the hospital. I have all the evidence, bank statements, text messages, everything. The officer nodded, jotting down notes. This is a serious accusation, he said. Are you sure you want to move forward with this? Once we open an investigation, it could get messy. I hesitated for only a moment. Yes, I said finally. I'm sure. He needs to learn that actions have consequences. The fallout was immediate. Jake found out about the report within days, and the first thing he did was call me, his voice dripping with fury. What the hell is wrong with you? He yelled, his words laced with venom. You called the cops on me? Are you trying to ruin my life? No, Jake, I said calmly, though my hands were trembling. You did that all on your own. I gave you a chance to make this right, and you threw it back in my face. This is on you. He laughed bitterly, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. You're unbelievable, he said. You're supposed to be my family. Family doesn't do this to each other. Funny, I shot back, my voice rising. Because family also doesn't steal from each other. You didn't think about me when you drained my savings, Jake. So don't expect me to think about you now. He hurled a string of insults at me, calling me selfish, vindictive, and a slew of other things I won't repeat. But I refused to back down. I'm done cleaning up your messes, I said, cutting him off. If you want to be angry at yourself. You did this, not me. I hung up, my hands shaking with adrenaline. The conversation had left me drained, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control. Jake could call me every name in the book. It didn't change the fact that he had crossed a line, and now he was finally being held accountable. As the days passed, the fallout rippled through our family. My parents were devastated, torn between supporting me and protecting Jake. Friends and relatives weighed in with their opinions, some siding with me, others accusing me of going too far. But no matter what anyone said, I knew I had made the right choice. Jake had spent his whole life dodging responsibility, but this time, he couldn't outrun the consequences. And for the first time, I felt like I was no longer just a safety net. I was standing up for myself. The thing no one tells you about standing your ground is just how isolating it can feel. Filing the police report against Jake had been a necessary step, but it set off a chain reaction I wasn't fully prepared for. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the people around us, the complicated web of loyalties, and the questions about what family really means. The legal process itself moved at a snail's pace. After filing the report, I was advised to gather more evidence, which meant combing through months of bank statements, saving every text exchange with Jake, and even contacting the dealership again for additional details about the transaction. It was exhausting, both mentally and emotionally. But even more grueling than the paperwork was the fallout within my family. My parents were at the center of it all, their reactions as divided as ever. Mom, to her credit, had been a rock for me since the beginning. She called me every day to check in, to reassure me that I wasn't crazy for taking this step. But I could tell she was struggling with her own guilt. I should have seen this coming, she said during one late-night phone call. Jake's always been impulsive, but I didn't think he'd ever do something like this. I feel like I failed both of you. You didn't fail anyone, I assured her, though my own voice wavered. Jake made his choices. This isn't on you. But Dad was another story. He wasn't outright hostile, but his disappointment in me was palpable. Is this really necessary? He asked during one particularly tense conversation. Do you realize what this could do to Jake's future? A police record could ruin his chances of getting a decent job. Maybe he should have thought about that before he stole from me. I replied, trying to keep my tone steady. Why is it my job to protect his future when he didn't care about mine? Dad sighed heavily, the kind of sigh that meant he was done arguing. I just think there's a better way to handle this, he said, leaving the conversation unfinished. The division didn't stop with my parents. My extended family began to weigh in, too, each person offering their unsolicited opinion as though they had a stake in the matter. My Aunt Kathy, who always had a soft spot for Jake, called me one afternoon with a thinly veiled lecture. I know what he did was wrong, she said, but he's your brother. Don't you think you should find a way to forgive him? Forgive him? I repeated, incredulous. Kathy, he drained my entire savings account while I was in the hospital. That's not something you just forgive. But forgiveness is what family is about, she said, her tone laced with condescension. I just don't want to see you two drift apart over this. I bit back my frustration, knowing it wouldn't do any good to argue. Forgiveness doesn't mean ignoring what he did, I said. It means holding him accountable so he doesn't do it again. The ripple effect extended beyond family. Jake's friends, who had always been a tight-knit group, somehow caught wind of the situation and decided to insert themselves into it. My phone started buzzing with messages from numbers I didn't recognize, each one angrier than the last. Wow, I can't believe you turned your back on your own brother, one text read. Jake told us what you're doing, said another. You're ruining his life over a stupid mistake. What kind of sibling does that? Some of the messages were outright vicious, calling me selfish, heartless, and worse. At first, I tried to respond, explaining my side of the story. But it quickly became clear that these people weren't interested in hearing the truth. They had already decided that I was the villain, and nothing I said would change their minds. For days, I felt like I was drowning under the weight of everyone's judgment. It didn't matter that I was the victim, the one who had been betrayed and left scrambling to rebuild what Jake had destroyed. To them, I was the bad guy simply because I refused to let him off the hook. But amidst the chaos, there were a few voices of support. A handful of family members, cousins, an uncle, even a neighbor who had known us since we were kids, reached out to tell me I was doing the right thing. Jake needs to learn that he can't just take whatever he wants and expect no consequences, my cousin Sarah said during one late-night call. You're brave for standing up to him. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're in the wrong. Those words were a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. But even with their support, the backlash was hard to bear. Every time someone accused me of being too harsh, a small part of me began to doubt myself. Was I overreacting? Should I have just let it go? But then I'd think about the hours I'd spent planning, saving, and working toward a sense of financial security, only for Jake to rip it away in an instant. I thought about the casual way he had laughed off my anger, the entitlement in his voice when he said, "You're not even using the money right now." And I remembered why I had taken this step in the first place. If the roles were reversed, I told anyone who would listen, would you tell Jake to forgive me so easily? Would you tell him to just let it go if I had stolen $8,000 from him? Those questions usually stop people in their tracks. They didn't have an answer because deep down, they knew the truth. If the roles were reversed, Jake wouldn't have hesitated to hold me accountable. But because I was the responsible one, the planner, they expected me to absorb the blow and move on without making waves. I refused to play that role anymore. The days turned into weeks, and while the legal process trudged forward, the rift in my family grew wider. There were moments when the loneliness of it all felt unbearable, but I clung to the belief that standing up for myself was the right thing to do. Jake had taken so much from me, my savings, my trust, my sense of security, but he wasn't going to take my dignity. Not this time. It was a Thursday evening when Jake showed up at my apartment unannounced. I hadn't heard from him directly since the confrontation at his house, though I'd been receiving plenty of secondhand updates through family and friends. Some said he was angry, calling me every name in the book. Others claimed he was spiraling, barely holding things together. I wasn't sure which version to believe, and frankly, I wasn't sure I cared. When I opened the door and saw him standing there, I barely recognized him. His usually well-kept appearance was gone. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair a mess, and there were dark circles under his eyes that hinted at sleepless nights. For a split second, I felt a flicker of concern. But then I remembered why he was here, and that concern was replaced by a wall of guarded indifference. "Jake," I said, my voice flat. "What are you doing here?" He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. "Can I come in?" I hesitated. Every instinct told me to shut the door in his face, but curiosity, and maybe a small part of me that still wanted to believe in him, won out. I stepped aside, letting him in. He walked into the living room and stood awkwardly by the couch, his hands stuffed into his pockets. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, but they didn't have the weight I was hoping for. His tone lacked conviction, as if he were saying them out of obligation rather than genuine remorse. I crossed my arms, leaning against the wall. "Sorry for what, exactly?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He flinched, as if the question had physically struck him. "For everything," he said, fumbling for words. "For taking your money, for not telling you. I didn't mean for things to get this bad." I raised an eyebrow. "You didn't mean for things to get this bad?" I repeated. "Jake, what did you think was going to happen? You drained my entire savings without asking. Did you honestly think I'd just shrug it off?" He looked at the floor, his shoulders slumping. "I didn't think," he admitted. "I was desperate. My car broke down, and I needed a way to get to work. I didn't have anyone else to turn to." "You could have turned to me," I snapped. "You could have asked Jake. But instead, you decided to take matters into your own hands and steal from me while I was in the hospital." He winced at the word steal, but he didn't argue. "I know," he said quietly. "I screwed up. I don't know how to fix it." I stared at him, my emotions a tangled mess. On one hand, I could see the desperation in his eyes, the cracks in the facade he usually wore so confidently. But on the other hand, his apology felt hollow, like it was more about getting me to drop the charges than actually making amends. "You're here because of the police report, aren't you?" I said, cutting through the pretense. Jake's silence was all the confirmation I needed. "I'm in a tough spot," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I'm already struggling to make the car payments, and now I'm dealing with this legal stuff on top of it. I can't handle it, okay? I just can't." He looked up at me then, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. "Please," he said, his voice cracking. "Please drop the charges. I'll pay you back, I swear. Just give me some time. I'll figure it out." "How?" I asked, my tone colder than I intended. "What's your plan, Jake? Because from where I'm standing, it doesn't look like you have one." He opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if searching for an answer he didn't have. "Just trust me," he said finally. "We're family." The words hit me like a slap in the face. Trust. The first casualty of his betrayal. How could I trust someone who had proven, time and time again, that he would put his own needs above mine? "Family doesn't do what you did," I said, my voice low but firm. "Family doesn't steal from each other. Family doesn't manipulate and guilt trip. You can't just throw that word around like it's a get-out-of-jail-free card." Jake's face crumpled, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of vulnerability that almost made me waver. "Almost. I'm trying," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm trying to make things right. I need you to give me a chance." I sighed, the weight of the situation pressing down on me like a physical force. "Jake, I've given you chance after chance. And every time, you've taken advantage of my trust. Do you even understand how hard it is for me to stand here and listen to you ask for another one? I know I don't deserve it," he said quickly, "but I'm asking anyway. Please just don't ruin my life over this." The irony of his words was almost laughable. "Don't ruin my life over this." As if I was the one who had crossed the line. As if he wasn't the one who had thrown my financial stability into chaos. "Jake," I said finally, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. "I didn't ruin your life. You did. And until you can take responsibility for that, I don't see how you're going to fix anything." His shoulders slumped, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But instead, he just nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of defeat and resentment. As he left my apartment, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a lingering sense of frustration. Part of me wanted to believe that he could change, that this moment could be a turning point for him. But another part of me, the part that had been burned too many times, knew better. Trust was like glass. Once shattered, it could never be the same. And with Jake, there was nothing left to hold on to. The wheels of the legal system turned slowly, but eventually, the case reached a pivotal moment. After weeks of paperwork, strained family dinners, and countless sleepless nights, my lawyer called me with an update. The prosecutor is offering a deal, she said. A deal. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the break I'd been waiting for, a way to resolve everything without dragging it out any longer. What's the offer? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. If Jake agrees to repay the full amount within 30 days, the charges will be dropped, she explained. But if he fails to pay, the case will proceed to court. 30 days. It felt like both a lifeline and a ticking clock, each second dragging me closer to another inevitable disappointment. Do you think he can do it? I asked, though deep down I already knew the answer. My lawyer paused, choosing her words carefully. That depends on him, she said finally. But given what you've told me about his financial situation, it's going to be a challenge. A challenge. That was putting it lightly. Jake could barely manage his day-to-day expenses, let alone come up with $8,000 in a month. But a part of me, small and stubborn, wanted to believe he could pull it off. When I called Jake to tell him about the deal, his reaction was a mix of relief and desperation. I can do it, he said quickly, the words tumbling out like he was afraid I'd change my mind. I'll figure it out. I just need you to trust me. There was again that word, trust. How? I asked, my skepticism impossible to hide. What's your plan, Jake? He hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw the cracks in his confidence. I've got a few things lined up, he said vaguely. I could sell some stuff, maybe pick up extra shifts at work. Don't worry, I'll make it happen. It sounded shaky at best, a desperate string of half-formed ideas that he was trying to stitch together into something resembling a plan. Jake, I said, my voice firm, I need specifics. What exactly are you going to sell? How many shifts are you picking up? Do you even know how much you can realistically make in 30 days? His frustration flared, his voice rising. Why do you always have to doubt me? I said I'll handle it. Isn't that enough? No, it's not, I said, my patience wearing thin. You've broken every promise you've ever made, Jake. Forgive me if I don't take you at your word. He fell silent, and for a moment, I thought he might hang up. But then he spoke again, his tone quieter, almost pleading. I know I've screwed up, he said, but I'm trying, okay? I'm really trying. Please, give me a chance to fix this. His words stirred something in me, a flicker of the bond we used to have, the brother I had trusted before all of this. For a split second, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that this could be the start of a new chapter, that Jake could prove me wrong and show me he was capable of change. But reality had a way of intruding on those fleeting moments of hope. The Jake standing before me now wasn't the brother I had grown up with. He was someone who had taken advantage of me, lied to me, and shown little remorse for the damage he had caused. Over the next few days, I wrestled with my decision. Dropping the charges would mean placing my faith in Jake, giving him one last chance to make things right. But what if he failed? What if I let him off the hook, only for him to squander the opportunity? On the other hand, sticking with the legal process felt like burning a bridge that might never be rebuilt. It would mean turning my back on the slim chance that Jake could redeem himself. It would mean accepting that our relationship might never recover. Family weighed heavily on my mind during those days. Conversations with my parents were tense, each one a tug-of-war between guilt and anger. Maybe this deal is what he needs to turn things around, Mom said one evening, her voice hesitant. He's scared, honey. This could be the wake-up call he's been waiting for. Or it could just be another chance for him to let me down, I countered. Dad, as usual, tried to play the peacemaker. You have to follow your gut, he said. But whatever you decide, just remember that Jake is still your brother. That doesn't go away, no matter how badly he screws up. Their words stayed with me as I weighed my options, turning them over in my mind like a puzzle I couldn't solve. In the end, it came down to one simple truth. Forgiveness without accountability felt hollow. If I dropped the charges, it wouldn't be because I believed Jake could change. It would be because I wanted to avoid the guilt of standing firm. And that wasn't good enough. When I called my lawyer to tell her my decision, my hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. We're moving forward, I said. She didn't try to talk me out of it, didn't question whether I was sure. She simply said, okay, I'll take care of the paperwork. The next call was to Jake. He answered on the first ring, his voice filled with cautious hope. Did you talk to the lawyer? He asked. I did, I said, and I've decided to stick with the legal process. There was a long pause, followed by a sharp intake of breath. You're kidding, he said, his voice breaking. You're really going to do this to me? No, Jake, I said, my voice firm. I'm not doing this to you. You did this to yourself. He didn't respond right away, But when he did, his voice was filled with anger. "You're unbelievable," he said. "I'm trying to fix things, and this is how you repay me?" "This isn't about repayment," I said. "This is about accountability. And until you understand that, nothing is going to change." He hung up without another word, leaving me standing there with the weight of my decision pressing down on me. It wasn't an easy choice, and I knew it would come with consequences. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity. Jake needed to learn that actions have consequences, and I needed to learn how to stand up for myself, even when it hurt. Months later, life started to regain a sense of normalcy, or at least something close to it. The legal process had come to its conclusion, with Jake facing penalties for his actions. The court ordered him to pay restitution in addition to a fine, and while it wasn't the kind of justice that felt satisfying in the moment, it was justice nonetheless. For me, the rebuilding process was slow and humbling. My emergency savings, the safety net I had spent years piecing together, was gone. Every dollar I saved felt like a small victory, but it also came with a bitter memory of why I had to start over in the first place. Our family, once close-knit, had fractured under the weight of what had happened. Conversations at family gatherings became stilted and careful, everyone tiptoeing around the elephant in the room. My parents, especially, seemed torn between supporting me and mourning the rift between their children. Jake, meanwhile, had moved out of state not long after everything was finalized. I found out through a mutual friend that he had taken a job in another city, hoping for a fresh start. Part of me felt relief. Distance meant fewer confrontations, fewer opportunities for him to twist the knife. But another part of me felt a pang of sadness. No matter how angry I was, no matter how much he had hurt me, he was still my brother. Our communication became almost non-existent. A few sporadic texts here and there, mostly logistical, updates on his court-ordered payments, a brief note when he changed his phone number, that sort of thing. But the substance of our relationship, the trust and connection we once had, was gone. On quiet nights, I'd find myself replaying everything that had happened, questioning my decisions. Did I protect myself, or did I lose something irreparable in the process? Could I have handled it differently? Should I have? There were moments when guilt crept in, whispering that I had been too harsh, that I should have forgiven him and found another way to resolve things. But those moments were always fleeting, because no matter how much I wanted to believe in forgiveness, I couldn't ignore the cold, hard truth. Jake hadn't just taken my money. He had taken advantage of my vulnerability, my trust, and my willingness to always clean up his messes. One evening, during a rare phone call with my mom, she broached the subject of Jake. "Have you thought about reaching out to him?" she asked gently. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Why?" "So he can tell me how much I ruined his life again." "It's not about that," she said. "It's about finding a way to move forward. For both of you." "Mom, I'm not the one who needs to move forward," I said, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "Jake is. And until he takes responsibility for what he did, there's nothing to talk about." She didn't push further, but her words lingered with me long after the call ended. The idea of reconciliation sounded nice in theory, but in practice, it felt impossible. Jake hadn't just hurt me. He had shown me a version of himself I couldn't unsee. And I wasn't sure if I wanted to open that door again, knowing what was on the other side. There were reminders of him everywhere, though. Every time I saw a shiny new car drive by, I felt a pang of anger, a visceral reaction to the memory of my hard-earned savings turned into someone else's convenience. But along with the anger came something unexpected: relief. Relief that I had stood my ground. Relief that I had finally set a boundary, even if it had come at a steep cost. In the months since everything had unfolded, I'd come to realize something important. Boundaries aren't about keeping people out. They're about protecting what matters most. And in this case, what mattered most was my self-respect, my financial stability, and my sense of justice. Jake's actions had taught me a hard lesson, one I would carry with me for the rest of my life. Family doesn't give you a free pass to betray someone. Love and loyalty don't mean enabling bad behavior or sacrificing yourself to clean up someone else's mess. Sometimes the hardest thing you can do, the thing that feels like a betrayal in itself, is standing up for yourself against someone you love. But it's also the most necessary thing. As the seasons changed and the dust continued to settle, I found myself focusing less on the past and more on the future. My savings account slowly grew, each deposit a reminder of my resilience. I reconnected with friends, threw myself into my work, and even started picking up hobbies I had abandoned during the chaos. Life went on, and so did I. Jake and I may never fully repair our relationship, and I've made peace with that. Some wounds don't heal completely, and that's okay. What matters is that I didn't let this break me. I learned how to stand tall in the face of betrayal, how to protect what's mine, and how to move forward on my own terms. And if Jake ever decides to reach out, to genuinely take responsibility for his actions, I'll listen. But until then, I'll keep building the life I deserve. $1, one boundary, one hard-earned lesson at a time.